Good morning, welcome. Apologies for the slight delay, but there had been I was coming by train and there was an accident, and fortunately there was a bus, but it lasted longer than it should have been. But I know that in the meanwhile you have been introduced to the idea of the summer school. My introduction would develop a bit on the same line, starting by saying why the Center on Social Movement Studies decided that I could look like Lorenzo Zamponi. But why the Center on Social Movement Studies organized several times a summer school on methodologies, and why this also developed upon a book that has been produced, let's say, from the Cosmos scholars on methodological practices in social movement research, which of course we think it's also relevant for studies of political participation. So the ideas to develop a book and then a summer school come from the fact that social movement studies have been really quite rich in terms of implementation and development of different methods, but there has been very limited reflections on this. So before this book on methodological practices in social movements research was published, there were two books which were collections, edited volumes that addressed some, but by far not all of the methods. And so the main idea was at that time, several years ago now, to organize a research seminar in which each of the postdoctoral researchers at the time took charge of presenting methods they were familiar with. And the idea was also to have these chapters as user-friendly as possible by adopting the same type of structures that you will find in several of the chapters you will read, which is following a bit all the choices and dilemmas that scholars have to address when they decide to use a specific method. So we thought in each chapter from the very beginning for which type of theories a method is more likely to be of help, and then what happens when you want to use this method in terms of preparing the field work, and then which are the specific challenges when you perform your research. And then how to analyze the data, and then how to write based on this data. The assumption was one that we shared at the epistemological level, which is the assumptions that methodologically the social sciences are plural, and that this plurality is something that has helped in the past, in particular in social movement studies, to collect information. It was particularly relevant in social movement studies because very few of the databases, which are often available for those who want to study, I don't know, social stratifications or electoral studies, were available for social movement scholars. So we were, I think, aware, even if we didn't discuss much these issues, that we needed, first of all, to acquire knowledge, scientific knowledge, but knowledge on different aspects of social movements. And so if we look back at the history of social movement studies, we see that many important scholars in the field have really developed different forms of methodologies to address the questions of how to improve our knowledge on social movements and specific aspects of political participation. So think about the ethnographic studies of the Chicago School, which played an important role in the beginning of the research on social movements by pointing at social movement as agents of change. Or think about the role of life history approaches, for instance, in historical analysis of social movements or analysis of social movements in areas and countries in which no archive was available. But also, and I think interestingly, what we saw in many research was an attempt to develop, to a certain extent, adapt type of methodologies that had been developed in other areas of political participation to the reality of social movement studies. So, for instance, in terms of mapping social movements events, lacking reliable sources collected by institutions of different times, the protest event analysis developed, starting with Charles Tilly in an historical perspective, in order to be able to map repertoires of actions. And in this, there was the attempt to implement for social movements specifically some types of ideas that in other areas of studies developed, for instance, through statistical data which were available there but not for us. Other research instruments that had some success was the collections of surveys at demonstrations. And this was, for instance, prompted by the fact that when social movement scholars wanted to use data on participants at the micro level, the polls that were collected on the entire populations were of little help, because usually social movement activists and even participants in protest events were very small minorities of the population. Now this is changing. In 2011, in countries like Spain or Greece or other countries, participants were many, and so also opinion polls on the entire populations can be used. But what we needed was also an instrument that allowed us to collect information on the characteristics of participants in protest events that didn't emerge clearly from the analysis of opinion polls. So what I stress, let's see, in the presentations of this volume, Methodological Practices in Social Movement Research, is that social movement studies have been by nature since the very beginning pluralistic in trying to combine knowledge based on quantitative sources and on qualitative sources. They have been, from the epistemological point of view, bridging positivist type of approaches in attempt to catch the realities, but also paying a lot of attention to the cultural interpretative dimensions. So in social movement studies, we can say there was no method and stride, as it happened in other disciplines. And I think this was also related with the fact that scholars really wanted to engage with the activists in the creation of new knowledge, in respecting also what the social movements were representing. And that this has created a good base for interactions. So if you look at some of the most fundamental edited collections in which for the first time we Europeans met the Americans or scholars from other countries, you find chapters that use quantitative analysis, chapters that use qualitative analysis, and in chapters that bridge, triangulate different type of approaches, and no frictions emerged on this. Maybe there were more debates about substantial issues, but methodological approaches were used in a pluralistic way. In defining this pluralism, I used also in other experiences I made when I was director of research and of studies at the European University Institute, and with colleagues like Michael Keating, we developed another edited collection, which was called Approaches and Methodologies in the Social Sciences, a pluralistic approach. So pluralistic something. And the idea there was also to give some more reflections about how in social sciences that sometimes are cleaved by the presence of different methodologies, how instead to try to build upon the skills of the different scholars, and especially to do this in a methodologically aware way. What we faced was a moment in the social sciences in which there was an attempt to present qualitative methods as useful but weaker than quantitative methods. So maybe still some of you read King, Cohen, and Verba books, which is an attempt, yes, to legitimize the qualitative methods, but still considering them as weaker than the quantitative one, in as far as they are supposed to meet the same types of criteria, the same type of rules of statistical type of analysis. On the other hand, we found approaches, interpretative type of approaches, that disclaimed altogether the possibilities to analyze and trying to approach the world by acquiring scientific knowledge. I think most of social movement studies have been moving in between these type of approaches, but what we try to do now with this summer school, and also with the ways in which we organize the PhD program at the Scuola Normale Superiore, is to respect each of these methodologies and try to develop reflections about the trade-off, the type of advantages and disadvantages, the type of caveats that one should develop when addressing these issues. And we do it at Cosmos. Now I say a few words about Cosmos, the Center on Social Movement Studies, which is a center in which master's students, PhD students, postdoctoral researchers, and juniors or seniors professors interact, doing a lot of empirical research on many different issues, from the institutionalizations of social movements to alternative direct action practices, from the macro to the micro and the meso level. And so we sort of constantly reflect on how different methodologies are to be applied, on the type of challenges that they present. And we reflect on how these methodologies specifically help us in developing specific type of research, which at the moment are willy-nilly all focusing on the issues of crisis. And this is one of the reasons why I put eventful times in the title of the presentations, also because I thought you will listen a lot with presentations, two presentations about methodological issues. I would like to go a little bit beyond and reflect also on what social movement studies need specifically now when we think in terms of the methodological challenges that we are going to address. And so I think that all these debates on the logics, the tools, the standards, strategies, cultures, traditions, approaches, and so on, have to be reflected upon with in mind the specific characteristics of the movements we want to address, the theoretical issues we want to address, but also the times we are living in. And as I'm going to say in this presentation, I think that these times present specific challenges, not only for theories, not only for politics and for us as citizens, but also for the methodological approaches that we use and challenges to think about methods that are able to explain change rather than the stable societies in which much of the research on social movements had developed. No, this time go. And so summarizing what's said until now, just in order to start with the more substantial part of the presentation, this summer school in particular, but also Cosmos in general, operate as a research institute following some types of pluralistic approach to many issues. So one of the argument that we have developed with Michael Keating in this book on methodological pluralism is that often the strides focus on the issues of quantitative versus qualitative, but in reality there are many trade-offs, many different questions that the social sciences have to address and that represent this type of, questions, puzzles, dilemmas. So there are many ways, there are many choices. Most of the cases we are not on the extreme, at least on these issues. I would say most of the social movement studies have adopted a pragmatic approach, trying to acquire and accumulate knowledge, but recognizing that what we know about societies is filtered through a lot of framing, understanding, learning, transformations, and so on. But it is important in this endeavor to remain in dialogue. In fact, this is one of the summer schools that have focused on methodologies. There have been many others, also methodologies on studying right-wing populism and other type of youth participations and other type of issues. So the idea is that there is neither an hegemonic approach, not just a pragmatic type of pluralism, but that pluralism needs to be accompanied by reflections on what it means to adopt different type of methodologies. And I think this is all the more true nowadays, because some of the main assumptions that had developed in all social sciences and in social movement studies and studies of political participations also is the fact that in stable times, we can assume that people act, if not in a rational way, at least in a reasonable way. We can assume that people adapt to some types of rules in their behaviors, or at least that they reason taking into account what happens in the past. This is only partially true nowadays, where scholars of all disciplines tend to address very quick changes in which what we know about the past is not useless, of course, but of limited use in order to understand changes that are changes in the societies, but are also changes in the ways in which people assess new times. And this is something that has been addressed in the social sciences in some niches, for instance, in research on revolutions or in research on democratization processes, but has been sort of put in bracket when understanding the development of mainstream phenomenon in established democracy. So I think this assumption is challenged, and it is challenged also the ideas that we can reason in terms of the independent variables that explain the dependent variables. I think a lot of the challenge nowadays is to introduce dynamizations of the pictures in which what we have learned about this type of connections in the past is to be reassessed, because these are not time of structures, to put it in this way, but much more times of conjunctures. They are also times in which agencies, also small groups, even of individuals, tend to play a larger role than usually expected. They are not times in which structure are no longer relevant. In fact, not by chance, there is a return also of Marxist approaches or approaches that look at the ways in which the relationship between capitalism and political system interact. But at the same time, I would say they are much more times of Rosa Luxemburg than on traditional approaches to Marx, in the sense that there are times in which I think social movements have to pay a lot of attention to the capacity of protest events or other sorts of collective events to produce breaks. So I notice that I did this, but I also noticed that other scholars tend to use much more frequently than in the past terms like momentum, terms like critical junctures, terms like crisis. And I think that this has consequences not only for our theorizations, but also for our methodological approaches. So, just to put a couple of pictures in the presentation. We were accustomed, I've a past disciplinary background in political science. Political science, and in particular approaches to political participation, especially party politics, have developed on the assumptions that the political system was frozen. So this was the terms which was used, and very brilliant scholars of the past, like Steinrocken, were used especially in the perspective of explaining how cleavages were pacified, how they had been institutionalized in the political system. What we see nowadays is that all the four cleavages that Steinrocken had addressed and that had been considered in various times and in various ways as stabilized, institutionalized, no longer capable of driving social movements, have re-emerged, together with debates about new potential cleavages. So the yellow vests have been defined as symbols of the conflicts between the city and the countryside, the core and the periphery, and there is a lot of debate also nowadays when interpreting electoral results on the role that the re-emergence of the peripheries as, or the city versus the countryside. But the center and the periphery have also re-emerged even within the frozen European system, with relationship with some of the most hot struggles and issues in terms of self-determinations in countries like the UK or Spain, in which again, the center versus periphery cleavage is important also in the interactions with other forms of cleavages. The re-emergence of very conservative values has brought about also a re-emergence of a sort of Rocanian cleavage between the church and the state. The so-called anti-gender movements in research by scholars like David Paternotte has shown to be strongly supported by the Catholic Church. Not all of it, but also with support within the Vatican, and the issues of values has been explicitly presented also by politicians that started to use symbols of religions in order to mobilize support on for their parties and for their political positions. On the other hand, movements like the very strong third wave of feminist movements have been challenging conservative values, bridging issues of social justice with issues of civil rights for especially different types of powerless or less powerful type of groups. So there is a re-emergence to a certain extent of attention to civil rights that had been considered as proper only for new social movements type, but that have spread now. And I think that in reflecting on the European Union election recently, the strong support for the Greens can be read as a return of attentions to issues not only of social justice, but even more of anti-conservative rights and the libertarian aspects of social movements. And the class cleavage, which I think will emerge also from these and other summer schools and conferences as reacquiring central values, but in different forms. So, what are we reflecting upon? To a certain extent, when we study social movements in this period, we see a lot of unexpected moments. For the 1989 transformations in Central Eastern Europe and then also in the former Soviet Union, scholars have reflected on the revolutions as moments in which suddenly things changes unexpectedly. Even if signs were there, they were not recognized. And a lot of protests that we look at are protests that indeed, I don't want to call all of them revolutions, even if revolutions is a term that not by chance reemerges often. They are sudden, They are big, they mobilize masses, and they are quite radical in their claims. So many of the previous of the protest events of the recent times, if we think to the 2011 Indignados or Occupy movements, but also Gezi Parks, also more recently Nuit Debout or Yellow Vest, or if we think about the Fridays for Future, are events which develop very quickly. New social movements could have been important here, but they are not the only type of explanations, and probably not the most important one. It is times in which social movement studies need to address issues of these intensifications of times, of the creation of momentum. And in fact, there are more and more also names of movements, like the momentum supporters of Corbyn in the United States, that theorize on the importance in these times of transformations of creating a momentum. This is why, for instance, some of the theoretical reflections that have emerged recently from Sidney Tarrow, I also have reflected on this, have tried to mobilize, also with reference to social movement studies, the ideas of critical junctures as a specific idea of change. That is not the type of change of stable times that, according, for instance, to neo-institutional approaches, were developing on the basis of adaptations, slow type of transformations, but rather times that have been defined as quick, fast, rapid, dramatic type of changes. So if we want to go back to the literature on party politics, for instance, main parties have been totally challenged, disrupted by protest, and they were those stable parties that seems to be destined to develop and to continue to lead the political system. Even in countries like Germany. Germany is the countries that our generation studied as a bipolar party system plus half the liberal parties, with Christian democratic parties and social democratic parties building the big bloc. Now, if you look at the European elections, or even more if you look at the opinion polls nowadays, the first party are the Greens, followed by the Christian Democratic Party in strong decline, and SPD, which fell down to 12%. And this is not Greece. So what I mean is these type of challenges are not Greece in the sense of a country which was living an emergency situation. Germany was a country considered as stable, where party politics still had its, in part, its traditional meaning. So these are times of crisis in the plural. Andrea Pirro has written on some of the ways in which some of these crises, like Brexit or like Grexit or like the emergency crisis, which has been called a crisis of humanitarianism, has developed with consequences especially on Europe. But this type of politics also, Ken Roberts had studied it in Latin America, developed in periods of crisis or strains in which existing policies and institutions emerge as ill-suited, incapable to address. So it is a moment in which changes are developing, also because what usually used to be functioning in the past is clearly no longer functioning. Whatever we think in terms of is this a positive or a negative political development, the reality is politics as it used to be is changing very quickly in all European countries. It's a time also of repoliticizations. This is something that for social movement studies is an important element to reflect upon. Chantal Mouffe defined this moment as a populist moment in the sense of breaking with the path of depolitizations that had developed with neoliberalism. And it is a time in which more and more often Antonio Gramsci is cited when he referred to an interregnum. So as a moment in which the old is dying, in terms of the neo-institutional analysis, we can say neither stability nor the traditional forms of routine changes are working any longer. And it is a time which is open to very different type of transformation. So what we see is very strong movements in the streets and the squares. We have a dynamic of movements and counter-movements developing both in terms of what Karl Polanyi used to call counter-movements, so big structural moments of resistance to liberal type of approaches to the economy, but also in terms of using movements types of strategies also on the right wing of the spectrum, also by right-wing populist leaders and so on. So there are times in which, to a certain extent, danger is there. There are dangerous times. There are times of resistance, but also times of attacks to specific type of citizens' rights that have developed in the past. And my claim is they are, in this intense time, theories and methods have to adapt to some specific characteristics of the moment. So a lot of unexpected events developed. Sometimes contingency can take a big role. They are understructured times in the sense that usually in our type of analysis and in the methodologies that follows from this, the reflection is about how events are structured, individual are structured, that is constraints by social structures, cultural structures, political structures, and so on. Now what we see is a challenge to all these type of structural constraints, which is something that also has been studied, especially in this niche approach to revolutions or democratizations that I think should be revisited more often in social movement studies. And there are times in which agencies is important, and the creations of momentum, as many social movement activists also define it, is an important moment to create what once in social movement studies a scholar called moments of madness, moment in which the structures don't count. But they are not individual agencies, they are also a lot of relational type. So what happens in this moment is that new relations emerge. This is why I said they are more Rosa Luxemburg type of times than the more structuralist, even Leninist times that have been referred to recently. That is times in which relationship had to happen in actions. And so also reflections on prefiguration, on the ways in which from the squatted areas to the squares of the movements of the indignados. These new ideas are formed, but also breaking points are set, is, I think, particularly relevant. I will go back to that later, because I would like also to leave some time for the discussions, and see also how these times have been addressed, which concepts can be mobilized to address these times in social movement studies. Mark Basinger, that has written very interesting analysis on the breakdown of the social movements, has suggested the ideas of waves. He says it often happens in social movements that events coalesce in times, that events tend to create each other and to be reproduced. So ideas like the one of cycles of protest or wave of protest, or Basinger used the idea of a tide, all help reflecting on the fact that movements tend to reproduce themselves. So it is not the political opportunities are, of course, important, resources to mobilize are important, but what is important is also what happens on the spot. How resources are created also because the ways in which people previously not active or previously active in other forms tend to change in their own ways of seeing things. And so the research on this characteristic of social movements is, I think, particularly relevant nowadays, in times in which we are all surprised by the fact that we don't see just the normal demonstrations for May Days or the gay parade, but we see a lot of very massive protest spreading very quickly, and also changing very quickly, because if we take just the analysis of the yellow vest, we see that they tend to contradict each other, not only because they looked at different aspects, but also because this movement change, because relations happens during the protests themselves, because people meet in the squares, because other actors decide what to do if they want to express solidarity and participate to the protest, or if they want to stigmatize them. But I think this is an important message to keep in mind also when reflecting on methodologies. We cannot bracket protest events as if they were black boxes. We have also to look inside them in order to understand what's happening, how they developed, and which type of identities, organizations, resources, norms they are creating. And in fact, Basinger is also is reflecting especially on ethno-nationalism, and is reflecting on the fact that specific movements goes in develops through what also other scholars have defined as moment of visibilities and moment of latency, moment of protest and moment of institutionalizations. And especially that movements tend to change in the moments in which actions take place. So that's, there is memory of the past. With Lorenzo Zamponi has studied this. Memories are relevant. They produce some types of legacy. But the moments we are living in are also moments that are relevant in creating changes. So Mark Basinger is talking of a thickened history. times in which change is so compressed, blaring, and fundamental that it is almost impossible to take its measures. So not the times when changes occur slowly, that time seems almost frozen, but times in which changes explode to a certain extent. And so the constraining parameters of politics undergo fundamental challenges, which is a way to say structures are no longer structuring individuals and collective actors. At the micro level, this has been presented as a sort of shifting game, in the sense that when people participate together, they tend also to change their own preferences. And we see this in the socializations of new generations to activism, for instance, which is particularly relevant in our research on young generations, but it is something that has been considered not as much as it should have been in social movement studies at the micro level. So people are not naturally selfish, but they build their own ways and concerns and understanding of politics. They build it especially in moments of transformations in which generations are created, and this tends to remain embedded at individual level with also macro consequences. And so these moments are important at the micro level because they change the ways in which people think about issues. They are also relevant in terms of the capacity of events to challenge structures. So O'Donnell and Schmitter, when studied democratizations, have pointed at moments in which structural or behavioral parameters to guide and predict the outcome are no longer working. And I think the methodological consequences of this are quite visible. They are also times in which the third of William Sewell's forms of temporality is particularly relevant. Reflecting about time, William Sewell had distinguished teleological, experimental, and eventful type of temporality. And the eventful time of temporality is a moment in which events are important because they challenge the existing structures. Looking just at connections between independent and dependent variables doesn't work. So they are a moment in which events, happenings significantly transform structures. They are moments in which are, Sewell says, inherently contingent, discontinuous, and open-ended. And so to be studied also in their type of development to see how and in which ways the type of moment, breaking points, is then reflected in the legacy that it produces. And for instance, if we think at the moments in 2011, we see that very quickly they have penetrated institutions through new parties that have been created, through referendums that have been called, through constitutional processes that have developed from Latin America to Iceland. And that this type of transformations didn't go through slow change and adaptations to rules of the games, but rather transcended this. I'll go back to this later, because I need to drink, but also to sum up so that we can have some debates. So back to methods, which are some of the consequences I want to draw from the idea that we are living in very quick times. I think the challenges are relevant, but they support the ideas of keeping within a pluralistic type of approach. First of all, without disclaiming what I said about the capacity of moments to transform structures, I think that also if we follow the most recent events relevant for social movement studies from 2011 to now, what we see is also that momentums do not totally disrupt the capacity of structures to intervene, and that victories by progressive movements are never definitive, so that what they produce is also backlash and the struggles that continues. In some research that we have done at Cosmos on the so-called Arab Springs, interviewing Egyptian activists in 2013, what they said is the protest events, the upheaval, the revolution in 2011 was not useless. But we now realize that we thought the revolution was a moment, but in reality the revolution is a process. So I think that keeping into account this moment of explosions doesn't mean that we have to disclaim or put aside all the reflections that have been done on the ways in which context matters, but also on the ways in which movements are embedded in complex fields or arenas in which also other actors participate. And so moment of changes are moment of changes for the progressive movements and left-wing politics they refer to, but there are also changes for the regressive movements or the right-wing politics they refer to. So I think it is more important than ever to consider this type of interactions between agencies and structures which relational approaches to social movements have tried to understand through concepts that have emerged. And I think we have, with this type of caveats in mind, to address the many issues which I think will be open for reflections in these 2 weeks here, which are weeks focusing on methods, but for each of the methods also all these questions remain open. And the questions are, quickly said, questions about how to select the topic. So from what I have mentioned, my own conclusions is that we still need research focusing on different issues, but we especially need research focusing on change and in the intensification of times. So to a certain extent, we could also go back to Roccan, or we could also go back to Tilly and the classic research on how our systems was formed. But I think we have to go back to them considering what they wanted to explain in the beginning, which is how something is formed, not how it stabilizes later on. So I think that they could tell us a lot if we go back to the analysis of how nation states were created or capitalism systems tended to develop, and apply this nowadays to moment in which nation states and capitalism are challenged in interregnum, in which I think these elements are important. So usually the main distinctions when you write your research design is between when selecting the topic theory-driven, method-driven, or problem-driven type of approaches. All of that are legitimated, but I think we can give a plus also to issues that problematize and help addressing these intensifications of times and changes. Another dilemma is often debated about research design using or developing within social movement studies, and it is the issues of how much values-free or committed research should be. Participatory action research is, for instance, a methodological type of approach that keeping attention on the scientific type of developing a research, also keep in mind the importance that research has for actors and try to develop instruments to interact with the communities that scholars want to address. I don't think this is the only way to do, and I don't think that this needs to be necessarily done. Also, we are studying very different topics, and participatory action research tend to apply better to some than to other subjects of research. But I think that these issues of what can be relevant for the societies in general is a quite important type of reflections, or let's say more and more important types of reflections in our times. Let's say, speaking through being honest towards this aim of commitment that I think is quite widespread in communities of scholars of social movements. However, I think that the issues of how to develop a scientific research, which is not only activist type of research, but could be acknowledged also in different environment, in different areas, and so on, is all the more important. The purpose of the social sciences is another issue that is often addressed when reflecting on the epistemological approaches. Explaining is usually the terms which is more often used when applying quantitative methods within a neo-positivistic type of logic, in which the assumption is that independent variables can contribute to understand the changing values on the dependent variables. I think this is useful. And there are many things that we continue to address within this logic. For instance, when doing research on how young people mobilize, how ideas of how to address global climate change are developed by the teenagers that mobilize in the streets for Fridays for Future, is still relevant. But I think that this element of understanding the more Weberian type of approach to the ways in which individuals and collective actors become agents through reflections and understanding on their own past and visions and prefigurations of their future, it's very important to keep in the pictures. Use of theories. Very often there is the debate about to which extent research proposals, it could be a master thesis, a PhD thesis, or a research proposals, projects to apply for funds. One of the discussions is about how much can we rely on pre-existing theories in order to find a way through our general questions, how to implement the general questions we have in mind. And I think that there is a lot of knowledge on social movements that allows also to build upon existing research done in the past. But also I think that we should not be content about the existing type of concepts and theories. In writing editing with Mario Diani, the Oxford Handbook on Social Movement Studies, what we tried to do was to bring into social movement studies also approaches that have been not considered as within the orthodoxy, like approaches looking at capitalism or approaches looking at times and geographies. And I think that this attempt should be continued, and that especially in times of intensification of changes, the generating of new theories is an important type of perspective. As Wolfgang Streeck has noticed in the past, one of the characteristics of the development of the social sciences in the past few decades has been specializations within different fields that tended to live a life of their own. What he suggests is that in order to address big problems, we need to go back to interdisciplinary type of approach. I think this is a good suggestion for the social movement studies, also to look beyond what has been done in the most proximate areas to social movement studies and political participation, to consider what is done in political sociology or political science, but also to move beyond, as many have done, looking at anthropology, looking at history, looking at theories, as normative theories, in order to find also new ideas to understand new types. This is also something that is relevant in terms of conceptualization. Using existing concepts is something that is always advisable in the beginning of a research project, but I think our times also require new concepts, new ways of naming things, from the identities of social movements to the definitions of the structures. We are full of empty signifiers that need to be filled in, and this cannot be done just by the scholars, but it is to be a search to which also scholars can participate in. Choices of cases and type of analysis and methods. I think I've said a lot already about the need to keep all the different type of methods open. Comparative research is, I think, extremely important nowadays to address all these type of issues. But case studies are also particularly relevant in this moment, in which also tiny, small moments, small spaces could have an impact in terms of prefigurating a different type of knowledge. So I would like to stop here and have some time for the discussion, go back to either methodological or theoretical issues if you like, and welcome once again all of you.
So thank you very much for this very interesting introduction here. I have two questions on both of the topic that you addressed. First one on the intensification of intensification of time. So my question is on the relationship between times of slow and incremental change versus moments of accelerated change. I think there's a problem that very easily we can have a bias in studying crisis and moments of crisis because everything very quickly becomes interpreted as a crisis. So my question is basically, when we study these moments of accelerated change, how do we understand their impact, and do we not have to place them in the context of slow and incremental change, and how to do that? That would be my first question. And the second question, I mean, it's very much basically, it's a very fundamental, let's say, a question of doing qualitative research and case studies. Well, basically the question is, how do we solve the problem that in a case study we just not only make a good story, but actually generate knowledge that is applicable to more than just one case, and making our study a case of something?
We take three, and then yes, we take. I would take three questions and then respond, and then take others.
Okay. Hi, hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm really very inspired by the use of intensification of times and eventful times. It's definitely something that resonates a lot with the Belgian context for the moment. And in that light, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the debates you mentioned about new cleavages. So you obviously referred to the map provided by Steinrocken, which could be helpful in understanding some of the things that are going on. But at the same time, you mentioned the frozen character of this map versus very rapid changes and the fast times that we're experiencing. So I was wondering, what is your personal feeling about potential new cleavages that might be emerging? Do we still call them cleavages? Is there a generational cleavage, for example, that is emerging? Is it something else that the Youth for Climate movements are pointing at? That would be my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed your presentation, especially on the times and then the methods that we should be taking into consideration. But my question is, if you look at history, concepts that we inherited, for example, political participation, it was a concept that was understood from an institutional perspective. Currently, times have made participation so fluid that you can hardly pinpoint, as one of the scholars put it, Jan van Dev, is a moving target. It's difficult to actually pin down what really participation is. So in this context, can one still say that approaching it from a mixed research design, as you have rightly, or as you suggested, because listening from you, I realize that you are balancing the two. You don't want to go just one way, either qualitative or quantitative. So, and with this fluidity in participation, is it advisable for one to recommend that in such a situation we go in depth to understand the issues, and in that case one might be looking at qualitative designs instead of maybe, using that institutional approach? Have you gone to vote and all those kind of things, the rational choice theories and all those things, are these still applicable? Will you recommend that maybe we go much more into understanding these issues than just, let's say, wanting to regress some issues and say, well, it is explaining this, it is that. Thank you.
I start with this interesting and important questions. The use of crisis, terms of crisis. It is true that it is often noted that the use of terms like crisis by institutions, for instance, is oriented to create the idea of an emergency, and then times of emergencies as times of Agamben, some suspension of the rules that protect the citizens, and so on. Crisis is a term that has very different meanings, so from signaling quick transformations in a positive or in a negative directions in medicine to the singling out of a moment of disruption. In fact, I think this is another example of the difficulties of filling in agreed upon meaning on terms that are used in different ways as empty signifier also in this sense. But I think that they are times in many areas in which we should recognize both the legacy. So, for instance, when we look now at what populist right-wing government do, I think we should not forget what happened before, which in some cases was helping the development of this type of positions. So I don't want to say that the use of the terms crisis should blind us towards the historical developments. And I think, though, that Gramsci interregnum is something that resonates with what I think is happening, and critical junctures is the scientific terms for this, which I found helpful. Neo-institutionalist debate, from Colliers to the other main scholars, have in fact posed the questions that you have posed now. How do we recognize the critical junctures that usually requires time in order to sediment and in order to be observed, while our times are times of intensifications? Well, I think that we are social scientists. Most of the concepts we use are sort of ideal type. So we don't have to, can I say, give a mark, a label to an event as being now and forever the critical junctures that has transformed things. We have done a research with other colleagues at Cosmos on Charlie Hebdo debate, the Charlie Hebdo attack, as triggering a discursive critical junctures. And what we have seen developing upon this perspective is that there are transformative moments that then interact with each other in a chain. Tipping points is the terms that institutional scholars adopt, that transform the track in which a critical juncture can have pushed the discourse or the events. So I think we should continue to interrogate ourselves about to which extent the specific things I'm analyzing is developing through rapid, quick changing dynamics, and to which extent it is instead there is a sort of routine type of changes. But that's looking at many things, like the ones I mentioned, transformations in the party system or transformations in the forms of actions, quick changes can be noted there. Also the emergence of some movements on the basis of very fast mobilizations of new people. So one could think about indicators like how new participants, new ideas, and so on. And I will address the two more methodological issues later on, because now I think these questions leads to the other one about the new and the old cleavages. There has been a tendency to single out many new cleavages. For instance, the Gall and Tan in the work of Gary Marx and Lisbeth Hughes, who single out something which I think is relevant nowadays. It is the sort of divisions more on libertarian versus conservative values than on social issues. And I think that this totally unexpected return of the Green parties could also be read in these terms. Or Hans-Peter Crisi, Edgar Grant and others have talked about cleavages between cosmopolitans and what some people have called communitarians. I think I'm a bit more Rockanian than they are, in the sense that I think there are many conflicts. But what Roccan said and defined as a cleavage is something which has three dimensions. A structural base, what Bartolini and Peter May call the empirical dimension of the cleavage. A normative base, so the development of an identity, and an organizational level, which is the creations of these parties that then contribute to structuring and freezing the cleavage. And I think that on this, for instance, when one talks about what is the terms now that is used, the sovereign versus the cosmopolitan, the reference to all those who support nation state versus all those who support globalizations. I don't think one can use the terms like cleavage for them, because we find positions for globalizations or against declined in different ways in different type of actors. And also the Gall versus Tan usually has been not just a new cleavage, but tended to overlap with the left versus right type of cleavages. So I would say there are many conflicts, and generational can be one of that, but I would reserve personally the term cleavages to what Steinrock and Lipset used to consider. But there is another term which has developed to address the multiple type of conflicts which could be active also within social movements, and it is the terms of intersectionality, which started to be used with reference to the women's movement, and point at all these different type of cleavages. Cleavages, I didn't want to say cleavages, conflicts. And this, I think, is important. Also in terms of the class cleavages defined by Roccan, the type of understanding, the type of consciousness is challenged by the presence of many differences within. So from what have been called by Beverly Silver as Polanyian versus Marxist type of labor conflicts, what Harvey has defined as the re-emergence of a sort of primitive forms of accumulation by dispossessions, and the conflicts that relate with this, and I think that this needs to be taken into account. On the more methodological type of questions, cumulative knowledge deriving from case studies, well, really a lot, I think most of social movement studies and the social sciences in general have developed through qualitative case studies. But I think that within these qualitative studies, so with a type of approach that for me is more Weberian than Durkheimian. We should not discharge numbers, because numbers are part of the evidences that could be useful in order to understand a specific type of cases. And I think that's what is important in order to answer the questions that you have defined as what is this a case of, that it is a question that I often ask myself and supervisees and mentorees and so on. What is important is to think in terms of which type of theories to mobilize when understanding a specific type of case. I think that case studies is much richer when it is comparative, which remains qualitative, but is not focusing on just one unit of analysis, but comparing several, even within a qualitative type of approach. And so also about the questions on the relevance of qualitative analysis, I think that they are very relevant nowadays, but also that our message in our PhD program is also we need to understand also the numbers, because also the numbers contribute to the understanding of knowledge, and can be helpful in order also to reflect on all these different steps that I mentioned, from how concepts are formed to how knowledge is collected. I think there was a question. Yeah, you wanted to ask her. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I actually wanted to go back a little bit when you were talking. Oh, okay, sorry. When you were talking about the about this critique about Gary King's book and company, and their effort to apply quantitative rules to qualitative studies, and I was just wondering if you know about the other way around. I mean, if there are efforts, particularly in social movements, about applying qualitative rules, if there are rules to quantitative studies.
Thank you for a very interesting speech. My question is on methodology, and it is particularly about the methods we use to study identity and identity formation. So I think it was a very interesting example you gave with the Yellow Vest protests that stress how we need to look at what's happening on the ground, on the spot, and the different developments that takes place within one episode of contention to understand how movements develop and how they reproduce their contention. So my question is, what is the status on identity research right now, and which debates are the most important to know? So personally, my PhD also seeks to explore identity formation that takes place within episodes of protest and the political contestation. And what I've been looking at so far are the framing perspective, where you explore how movement activists represent themselves through discourses, but that's merely the identities that they want to portray, not necessarily their own identity and their own disputes. Another perspective could be activist narratives, where you look at personal stories and see how an individual changes its self-perception by being part of a movement, but that is very hard to that's very narrow, and it's hard to generalize to an entire movement, since you can only do a few stories because it takes so much time. So these are the two methods that I've been looking into the most, but I'd really like your perspective on what's going on in the methodology field right now.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk. I just wanted to ask a little bit about when you're talking about history and looking back through history and looking how systems develop. I had my annual review last week, and my examiner asked me, because I think about identity and stuff and what inspires activists, and he asked me, how far back do you go? Which is a very difficult question to answer. Obviously, there's not like a specific time, like 50 years ago, stop. But I wanted to ask if you had any sort of ideas or perspectives, like how you work out when you stop. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You gave me an idea about the book to write, which I think has not been written yet. But what I can say is what I think quantitative analysts could learn from the qualitative type of approach, as I have seen it developing in terms of methodological type of reflection. So I think that there has been, and it is positive, a lot of self-reflections on both sides. So both in the quantitative type of studies and in the qualitative type of studies, the attention given to methodological issues is visible in the fact that most PhD work include a chapter on methodological choices and articles report on the type of methodological challenges and so on. And I think that the first step would be recognize this in interactions with each other, so that in all of these disciplines there have been good and less good work, but in none of these disciplines there have been just a naive type of endorsement of existing methods and so on. And this is something that I've seen working with colleagues who use both type of methods. So it is also a sort of a lived experience of the ways in which the social sciences, when they are good sciences, are self-reflexive. What I think is a message in the qualitative methodologies that could be useful also for the quantitative methodologies is how important the role of the researchers is. Because in many cases, quantitative research are presented as if the researchers played no role or a little role as possible and just as implementing his or her technical knowledge. While what I know, because I've been using quantitative analysis myself, is that there are thousands of choices which are made and which can influence the results, not necessarily used in an instrumental ways, but from the operationalizations or even before the choice of some type of databases versus others, the cutting point, the transformations of the variables, the type of indexes that you choose, and so on. There is a lot of intervention. So I think that all this idea about replicability and sort of emphasizing only the strength of the quantitative methods is, I think, something that could be usually reflected upon in acknowledging all the limits. And acknowledging all the limits, I think, also means that possibilities for triangulations or mixed methods could be taken into account more seriously. Of course, the triangulations present sometimes a challenge, which is it's already difficult to become good quantitative method, good in quantitative or good in qualitative methods. Mixing the two could be quite time-consuming, but I think that it is feasible, keeping maybe a main methodological approach, but then bridging it also with others, co-authoring with other junior or senior scholars that adopt different methods is also a way to understand how the method works from the inside. Well, I think also trying to achieve this basic knowledge of also the other methodologies that allows to assess the trade-off when using them. But maybe we can write this book together once. And about the identity research, it's a huge question, and I think it is a very important one. Also, it is one of the questions in which, let's say, the mainstream social movement studies are interacting a lot with other types of approaches. For instance, the questions of identity formations has been addressed a lot in research on Gezi parks. And I think one of the reasons and the ways in which it has been addressed, why it has been addressed and the way in which it has been addressed is also related with the fact that those who studied social movements in Turkey were more interdisciplinary than we are. So, for instance, they mobilized also knowledge from political theory about subjectivization that usually is not mobilized in social movement studies. Cultural studies gave a contributions to this. So I would say from my own approach that what you are doing is looks very reasonable to me. So looking at the framing, life histories are also interesting even when you can collect just some. There is a book by Auiero, who is made only of 2 life histories, but it is extremely interesting about the socializations of these 2 women. And so it can be interesting. I've seen that in reflections on identities, work by Rancière has been used in this other literature, and I think it is right also to consider this in this moment of changes in which politics come more to the fore and so on. Something that I also would add to this, and we are doing it in this analysis of the Charlie Hebdo, is together with the analysis of framing, paying attention also at the justification in what Boltanski and Thévenot have done in their book on justification, that is considering also, besides the specific frames, which are the broader normative word of justifications, they say people refer to. And then maybe also going back to some terms which were important in the past in social movement studies but have been abandoned. For instance, ideology or intellectuals. I think it's something that also contribute to the development of identities. In terms of methods, in my work in the past, focus group, and so group interviews, have been very helpful in understanding identities information. So small groups of people, interviews with small groups of people have these particularities. People tend to use the we instead than the I, as in life histories. And this is also a way that help people reflecting on collective forms of identities. And in the histories of social movements, the work by Turenne and Melucci, also from the methodological point of view, had been quite innovative in this use of in group interviews, sociologie de l'intervention in the case of Turenne, which were sort of experiments, but were experiments not with fictitious people, but with activists participating in social movements. And I think this could be helpful. How far back to go? What did you answer?
How far back they go.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the answer for me, but I think it's probably more like with the structural sort of things, like because my background is in history, I find Tilly doesn't go back far enough and makes some mistakes because of that. So I just wondered what you thought.
Well, I think you gave a good answer. What I think it is important is the type of questions that you address. Of course, the constraints that you have, because also pragmatic constraints are relevant. But also, how do you consider time? So going back to Scuola, why is time relevant? So if, for instance, it's relevant because of the memories, it means that you do not need to go back and study that period, because what is relevant for you is how that period is still playing a role, acknowledging that it is filtered by other events and so on. What I think is interesting in terms of historical type of analysis is also to find parallel times. So Lorenzo Bosi and Lorenzo Zamponi and others are doing research that compares nowadays as time of economic crisis with previous times, like the 70s in Italy. We see that there is often also a parallel made between our great transformations and Polanyi's great transformations. I think some comparative analysis with those times could be relevant as well. So I think it could be different strategies, but it is important to consider the existing constraints and then also seeing how do you want to consider history. This reminds me also that I wanted to add something about how to analyze these times of very intense changes, the questions that you asked. And I think one necessary way is to follow movements in different steps. So, for instance, we are doing survey at demonstrations. Other scholars in France have done surveys at demonstrations of the Yellow Vest. I think you need to collect and collate the evidences on different demonstrations in different times, because these events can change a lot. Take in Brazil in 2013 the movements for on transport systems and so on. It's a movement that changed. Takes the Fridays for Freedom, for Future. Is a movement that is constantly changing. So I think that we have to multiply the times in which we collect information and be aware when we use these informations that they are not covering a movement as such, but specific phases and moments in these movements itself.
Hi. I have more than, not really questions, sort of comments, but can be asked also as questions, because I was quite inspired by the sort of analysis that you gave on what do you define as today being intense times. And you said that one of the, it can be explained as understructured, but I think what makes these times as uncertain times, intense times, is that they're both understructured and overstructured. And by understructured, I mean, for example, taking into account Fridays for Future, one could argue that those protests are very understructured based on who organized it, who were the participants. It was very spur of the moment and very quickly ascended throughout Europe. But also, it can be seen as being regular repertoires of action going on what is considered of classic sort of protesting. And it goes along what Issin argues as differentiating between active citizens and activist citizenship. So you can also argue that although we are in very turbulent and intense times, it's not very challenging what is considered to be sort of overarching I don't know what I wanted to say with this, but it's always conventional ways of acting contentiously. It's not very, it's not changing the structures, but what is changing the structures, what I would argue, are there's sort of a blurred lines of where contentious action is played out. When we look at different arenas, what is usually considered, for example, the institutional arena with party politics, I think there is not such clear lines between those and social movements, because I think you can see very big changes in how social movements are structured and the transformation that goes from a social movement to a party politics. I think it's very, and you can also look at it from the European elections, because as you already stated, the victories of Greens and the radical right, both are very supported by social movements, and sort of the key actors sometimes come from social movements. So my question would be, then how would you place those theories from the transformation of social movements to party politics? How does that fit into the current turbulent times? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, no, I think I see your point about the overstructuring, but in the sense that also protest events have a sort of choreography, instruments that they use, from social media to leaflets and so on, that reflect what Still used to say, that repertoires are constructed in the long term, are frozen to a certain extent, also the repertoires. And I think that this type of legacies is important to recognize. Still see people marching in the street, the Occupy and the squares of the Indignados were building upon existing type of... And I didn't want to say that these structures no longer play a role. But if we look at the social movement studies, the traditional explanations is you tend to have protest when there are political opportunities and there are resources to be mobilized. Think about 2011, that type of political opportunities that usually were considered as such by previous social movement studies were not there, because it was a moment of crisis in which either right-wing governments tend to close down even to the relationship with trade unions that had been considered as quite consolidated, or left-wing, center-left government that's moved very much to the right themselves. So the traditional type of opportunities were not there, this type of structures. resource mobilizations were not there, how did it happen that, I don't know, in Egypt, where the regimes had moved not towards liberalizations, but towards more authoritarian interventions, where repression was very high. How did it happen that there was this protest? And I think that there, the type of traditional approach to social movements is small, little purchase, because one has more to explain how those events, eventful protest in William Sewell terms, like the 25th of January in Egypt, became capable of producing those opportunities. And this is also relevant for your questions about how did the blurring of the borders between institutional and movement politics, on which I'm finishing various research projects on movement parties, referendums, and so on, and on which it is true that there is this other totally unexpected events, that these very critical movements towards institutional politics entered institutions and gained big success. Or the fact that many social movements entering institutions address the issues of constitutional politics, which is interesting because it was not something that movements of the past tended to do. And I think that here it is also a matter of opportunities, but more in terms of created opportunities. So the movements have in 2011 developed from a deep disappointment with the political system, which was already there. They have contributed to catalyze it. They have contributed to a breakdown of the existing parties. And then, since movements tend to be very variegated and try different type of instruments, some groups also tried to build political parties. This is something that we find also in other movements. But the unexpected things was that they had quite fast degree of success. And then that once they entered institutions, this challenge of keeping in mind, playing on two arenas, the movement arenas and the party arenas, also had an effect. But in this sense, I would say, understructured in the terms that, notwithstanding a closing down of political opportunities and a degeneration, impoverishment in terms of resource mobilization, there was protest. So it was suddenly catalyzed. I mentioned the European case, but for instance, if we look at Latin America, and we look at Bolivia, for instance, it was a series of moments of closing down of opportunities and challenges to the movement's resources that, instead of producing demobilization, increased mobilization. And these are also often the puzzle that still are open. When do dictators or semi-dictators succeed in taming movements through repressions, and when instead they produce these sudden changes, as in Egypt, Asian countries, African countries, and so on. I think it's time, it's 1 o'clock, so the organizers